Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome back to our fourth session. In this session, we will summarize our previous session that discussed chapters 4 and 5. We will summarize chapter 6 and we will discuss the historical events that happened in chapter 6. And finally, we will have a discussion on the chapter.
Last week, we discussed chapter 4 and 5. So a quick summary of chapter 4 and 5. In those chapters, they are sort of correlated. Machiavelli addresses the difficulties that a prince that might face or encounter when acquiring a new principality, and he discussed different constitutions and how he can deal with it. So in an example of a prince and his ministers, and how the authority is ultimately under one authority, which is the prince, as opposed to another type of constitution where we have a prince and barons, where the prince doesn't have the ultimate authority, and barons do have a say in the governing body. And then we moved to chapter 5, where sort of we delved into more where we have the people are used to live under their own laws or under freedom, which resemble the example of prince and barons. Machiavelli in this chapter discusses how we could sort of maintain such type of principality and gave different methods, 3 courses of action, either through ruining it or going and residing in that state, or through letting the people use their own laws, except that he would be drawing tributes from them, and also forming an oligarchy where he can sort of ensure the loyalty of some of the groups so he can maintain and preserve that state. So that was just a brief summary of chapter 4 and 5, and I'll pass it on to Noor, where she can give us a summary of the next chapter, chapter 6.
In this chapter, Machiavelli is addressing the concept of individual and personal success, and he highlights the ideal qualities of the prince on a personal level, noting the theme of prowess and ability and opportunity, which is also referred throughout the book, not only in this chapter. So one way that rulers may acquire states is through their own prowess, meaning that they have their own abilities rather than using the good fortune or noble birth or good luck. They rely on their personal prowess, and relying on your personal prowess is a difficult method of acquiring a state, as Machiavelli highlights. And he claims that new princes who win their principalities with prowess acquire their positions with difficulty, but then they're able to maintain them easily. And the primary difficulty that they face involves the establishment of a new state, which is complete with new institutions and new laws, and that there is nothing more difficult to handle, more doubtful of success, and more dangerous than initiating change in a state's constitution. He encourages these leaders or innovators to stand alone so they can counter this dangerous work with the threat of military and political prowess. So using force, there's a quote where he says that there's no man should be unarmed or something like that. So it's always has that background with him. And he gives the examples of rulers who triumphed on the strength of their own prowess, including Nebi Musa, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. So he essentially states that it's better for a prince to be able rather than to be lucky. And Machiavelli stresses in this chapter that through ability or opportunity and prowess, as he describes it, a prince will not have to depend on the aid of another, then therefore will not be indebted to anyone and will be able to maintain his rule in the long run. And yeah, that's essentially what he talks about throughout this chapter. Now, Mariam's talking about the history.
In this chapter, he gives a lot of examples. He gives 4 examples of people who used the circumstance and their own ability to institute a new empire. And these 4 aren't exactly examples people can use in their daily life, as per se. So he gives an example of Musa alayhi salam, and he states that we cannot discuss this because he was doing the will of God and he had God on his side. The second example he gives is of Cyrus, probably the only applicable example. And then he gives 2 mythological examples of legendary heroes. And the first is Romulus, who instituted Roma. And the second is Theseus, who instituted Attica. And then he gives an example of a failure in his opinion, which is Girolamo Savonarola came and took over Florence. And then he gives a final example, which he says is a minor one, which could be comparable to the first four, but isn't. And inshallah, we'll discuss why. And it's hero of Ceresus. So inshallah, we'll start with Musa alayhi salam. And the important thing is to make sure we put them into a historical context. Another thing with the story of Musa alayhi salam, if we're looking at the circumstance which led to him being a Nabi, as per se, we need to look at Bani Israel and their condition. And this starts with Nabi Yaqub alayhi salam. So Musa alayhi salam is the descendant of Yaqub through his son Lawi, who then had a son named Qahat, and then Imran. And from Imran, you have Harun alayhi salam, Maryam, and Musa alayhi salam. So now we need to see what transformed them from being invited into Egypt to then becoming slaves. And this is done by looking at the rulers at the time. So during the time of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, it was the 18th dynasty of kingship. And you were ruled by Akhenaton and his wife Nefertiti. And the god that they worshipped was Atun, which some form of evidence to suggest that this was a monotheist religion. And the basis of that evidence isn't very strong. It was kind of concluded by Freud, but a lot of people take by that theory, given the circumstances and kind of the events which occurred in Egypt at the time. And then Akhenaton and Nefertiti had 3 children, 2 of which remained the worship of Atun as the religion. But then the more famous of sons, which is Tutankhamun, and after his mother died, changed the religion of Egypt back to its former religion of Amun. But he only ruled with this title for 5 years before he died at the age of 19. And given that he had no successors, he gave it to his great uncle Ai and continued the work of Tutankhamun in destroying all monuments which belonged to Atun. But Ai didn't rule for long, so he gave it to his son-in-law, also kept with the tradition of worshipping Amun. Once he died, he did not have any successors, so the rule went to his vizier, which was Ramses. And then came the 19th and 20th dynasties of the Egyptian rule, and they all remained with Amun. And so between that rule, that the events of Qusat Musa alayhi salam, there is this evidence which suggests that this may be, given that in both the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran, which obviously is the source of truth, the ruler of Egypt at the time was called Pharaoh, or the Pharaoh. But this title was not used for the kings of Egypt until the 18th dynasty, and it wasn't firmly used as a status of both religious superiority and kingship. It was in the 19th and 20th. So this is a set of evidence to suggest that Musa alayhi salam was born and raised during this time. This gives the range between, say, the events of Yusuf alayhi salam to Musa alayhi salam ranges between 77 years and 238 years difference. So it's a huge span, but Islamically this is accepted. And then we go into the story that we know. So the Pharaoh had a dream, and the tafsir of the dream was that a son of Bani Israel will come and he will take your kingdom. So he decides that he will kill all the sons of Bani Israel. Moses' mother had a hidden pregnancy, so nobody knew that she was pregnant, which is very, subhanallah, because we know that the stories of Isa alayhi salam and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa were very similar, that their mothers had hidden pregnancies for their own protection as well. And then once she gives birth to him, of course, she's scared for his safety. So she asks a carpenter to make him a wooden box by, of course, an ilham by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that she can put him in the river. So Musa alayhi salam is put in the river and he's picked up by the wife of Pharaoh, Asya, which is one of the four of the greatest women of the world. And he was raised in the household of Pharaoh for 40 years. And this is what's really interesting, because we need, with all the prophets and the imams, as we discussed, that it was their environment which honed this love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and which prepared them for their prophethood. And Musa alayhi salam was not raised with Bani Israel as per se, or with his family, but he was raised with one of the four women of the world. And that kind of gives you the importance of these women in the lives of these prophets. I mean, Isa alayhi salam also had his mother, who was one of these women, and the Prophet had two of these women in his life. And then after these 40 years, the event happened where he killed a soldier, and out of fear, he had to run away. And then when he got into Madian, met Nabi Shu'aib alayhi salam, he stayed with Nabi Shu'aib for 10 years. So that's another 10 years of preparing himself for the spiritual and the divine revelation that he was going to receive. And then after that, when he turned around 79 years old, as some narrations say, he was sent back to Egypt by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are the events which Machiavelli refers to when he's saying the circumstances which gave him the ability to become king, and then his ability as well. So the circumstances was the enslavement of Bani Israel, and his ability came from his childhood, being brought up with one of the greatest women alive and a Nabi as well. The next personality that Machiavelli mentions is Cyrus the Great, which in Arabic is Quraysh. And he lived in Persia, but he was provided with an opportunity to invade Media. And Media was controlled by Astyages. Quraysh was invited to invade by one of the soldiers or generals of Astyages, and his name is Harpagus. So Harpagus comes to Quraysh and he tells him that we are not satisfied with the condition that we're living in. We will help you in raiding Media, which at the time had the largest kind of scale. So when Quraysh came with his army, Astyages told Harpagus to prepare his own armies to go to war against Quraysh. But then once they met at the battlefield, Harpagus switched sides, and Astyages just surrendered instantly. Quraysh did not kill him. Instead, what he did, he made him his advisor and married his daughter, so that he became the son-in-law and a legitimate ruler of the Medes people. And in this way, he was able to win the love of the people without needing to cause any form of bloodshed. And after that, he then went to conquer Neo-Babylonia and Lydia in Egypt. He gave everybody the liberty to follow their own laws and their own religion. He never enforced any new things on them. And that's why most people call him the liberator, and the Jews call him the anointed by God. And then we come to the two mythological heroes that Machiavelli gives. It's interesting that he gives mythological heroes, and there could be two reasons for this. One is during the Renaissance, these classical stories were just being kind of brought to surface. And so perhaps historians at the time didn't know the difference between mythology and legend and true history. So they kind of just read everything as it was, or they knew, and Machiavelli was kind of making fun of the Medici in giving these two unrealistic and unattainable examples. And you'll see they're not very good examples to give anyway for such a chapter. The first example he gives is of Romulus, and the second is of Theseus. Romulus is a twin. So he has a twin brother named Remus, And they are either the son of Mars or Hercules, and then Rhea Silvia, which was the queen of Alba. And she had her husband at the time. The story goes that the king of Alba is overthrown by his brother, Amulus. And what he does is he can't kill Remus and Romulus because their father has some form of god status. The mother does is she gets a basket, she puts the twins in the basket, and she puts it in the Tiber River. And then the basket gets caught on the roots of a fig tree, and a she-wolf comes and suckles the twins to growth, and woodpeckers would provide them food. And a shepherd and his wife take them in. And they grow up with the shepherd and his wife, shepherding all the sheep. They get into an argument with the shepherds of Alba, and Remus gets arrested by Romulus. And so Romulus decides to get an army of shepherds to go and fight against the king of Alba and retrieves his brother. Once he retrieves his brother, he's given the opportunity to rule Alba, but they both decline and decide that they want to create their own empire. And so they go walking for days until they find these two hills. Remus wants to build his empire on one hill, but Romulus disagrees and he wants to build it on the other hill. So Romulus, being the smart one, decides to build a trench around the hill. So Remus starts to make fun of him and jumping over the trench and whatever. Romulus gets really angry and kills his brother. After he kills his brother, that kind of paves the way for him to have an independent empire, and he founds Roma. Then we go to the story of Theseus. Theseus has two fathers. One of them is Aegeus of Athens, so he's the king, the prince of Athens at the time, and the second is Poseidon. And his mother is Etheria of Troezen. And he lives with his mother. Aegeus put his sandals and a sword underneath a rock outside the city, and he tells the mother, once he becomes of age, let him come and visit me, and if he comes with this sword and these sandals, I will recognize him as my son, and he will be the rightful ruler of Athens. And so when he's around 20 years old, his mother tells him the story, and he goes to set off to Athens to find his father. Once he gets to Athens, he's not recognized by his father, but his father's wife, Medea, the sorceress. And of course, she does not want him to be the rightful ruler. So she wants to kill him. The first task she gives him is that he has to go and kill the Marathonian bull, which is the same Cretan bull of Heracles. He ends up doing it and comes back, and she gets angry, so she wants to poison him. When he's putting the cup of poison to his lips, his father recognizes him, hallelujah, and they get reunited. Once that happens, this annual event occurs where 14 young men and women have to be sent to Crete into the labyrinth of Daedalus to face the Minotaur. Theseus wants to prove himself to his father, and he volunteers to go to Crete to face the Minotaur. When he gets to Crete, the princess Ariadne falls in love with him, and she gives him all the ins and outs of the labyrinth. And then she gives him a golden thread and tells him that you can use this to navigate yourself in the labyrinth. Once you kill the Minotaur, you follow the string back to safety, and that's what he does, and he ends up slaying the Minotaur. He goes back to Athens. In Athens, had 11 surrounding settlements. So this is the important bit. What he does is he increases the naval capacity and strength of Athens and decides to unite the 11 settlements into the one state of Attica. And how he does this is he forces all the aristocrats, if they wish to have any kind of formal positions in his new democratic republic, that they would have to come to the city of Athens, which meant that all the other settlements that they owned became kind of rural areas where artisans and local farmers would live. He created a hierarchy for his city in that way. But at the same time, there was some form of political equality between them. Well, he called it political equality. And to celebrate, so the important thing he also did was he never let people forget this. He created an annual celebration where he brought everybody together and they would celebrate the formation of Attica. The other example he gives, which is important, is Girolamo Savonarola. So we kind of mentioned him in week 1. He was the priest who came, or friar who came, who wanted to liberate Florence, and he kind of helped get rid of the Medici. So there were a lot of enemies and friends of Savonarola, and Firenze kind of split into these two different districts. There were two main supporters for Savonarola, the Fratisci and the Piagnone. So the Piagnone were the kind of simple people who wanted to they actually felt genuine about being sinful and they wanted to get rid of them. And this was a large majority of Florence. The Fratisci were more of the friars, the bishops, and that kind of thing. And then he had three main enemies, and they were the Bigi. They were the kind of simple people who ended up helping Piero de' Medici come back. The Arrabbiati, they're the major group, and they were supported by both Francesco Sforza, the Duke of Milan, and Pope Alexander VI. And the last were the Tiepidi, and they were the kind of aristocrats of Florence that felt like they were losing their power to Girolamo Savonarola. And so the reason why Machiavelli kind of suggests that he lost it is because he did not apply force against his enemies. He kind of stayed on the side of peace, and he was only giving advice and that kind of thing. And when it came to proving himself, instead of using the people to support him, he kind of sacrificed himself and became a martyr. And Machiavelli says that this was a good move in terms of keeping his image alive, but it wasn't very useful for keeping Florence in the state which he wanted it to be. The final example that Machiavelli gives is Hero of Cyprus. This example isn't a particularly strong one in terms of the points that Machiavelli is trying to make that for instituting a new kingdom. The reason for that is because Hero only took what was already a kingdom. He reclaimed a kingdom for himself rather than instituting a new one. So it's slightly different. But the methods in which he did so was according to opportunity and his own ability. And this is why Machiavelli uses him as an example. So if you guys remember, I think last week we talked about Pyrrhus and his failed attempt to go into Sicily. So Hero was actually one of the generals for Pyrrhus. And when Pyrrhus became very tyrannical and was kicked out, he was one of the generals that stayed in Sicily. And as soon as Pyrrhus was taken out of the way, a tyrant king came into power over Sicily. And so what happened was Hero's like, I have the troops, I have the ability, I'm going to get rid of this tyrant. And he got rid of him. And when he did, the people praised him and they actually got him to the status of becoming a king. The thing is, this wouldn't have happened if he wasn't a citizen. So he planned ahead and he married a daughter of an influential family to get citizen status at Sicily. So it was according to his own ability and the opportunity that there was a tyrant ruler that he was able to become this king. Yeah, and those are the 6 examples Machiavelli gives in this chapter. I mean, I love this chapter. I think it's one of the best chapters in this book in terms of what we can apply to our daily life. If we kind of strip back and look at the beginning of this chapter, Machiavelli gives conditions in which someone can achieve this status. The first thing he says is that if you have endeavors to become a ruler, the first thing that you should do is look at the path and try to imitate people who've successfully done it before. And I was like, this is applicable to anything in life. That what we need to do if we have any form of aspiration is to look at the people who had succeeded and then follow in their footsteps. And Machiavelli gives 2 important points about this. The first is that even if your abilities do not match their abilities or your opportunities do not match their opportunities, simply following their path will give you an inkling of how it feels like or the experience which it provides. And the second thing he says is that you need to aim higher than the achievable target.
Exactly.
So he gives the example of the archer and how archers aim higher than their target so that their arrow gets into the target.
Absolutely.
So this is completely applicable to us. I mean, we all aspire to be insan al-kamil, right? And our examples of insan al-kamil are the prophets and the imams. And the problem is so many people say, oh, this is not achievable, this is unrealistic for us, and they do not aspire after it. But what Machiavelli is saying here is we need to aspire, even if it's unachievable, for that goal, because just stepping in the same footsteps as they did will give you an inkling of the experience that they felt.
Or a savior of it, as he calls it in the book. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Absolutely agree on this point. And that's why you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Quran always gives us examples and stories. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously is the best teacher, giving us our imams and the prophets. That's the benefit and the worth of looking at history and learning from others, because like as he describes it, it's like people often have beaten that path and have walked that path, and see, so we learn from the experiences and we built on it. I think another interesting point that he adds on, moves on from saying that, talking about the difficulties that the prince that might face, and he sort of make it a proportionate to the ability of the prince, and says the more, basically the more ability, the more experience, and the more insight the prince has, the least difficulty that he faces, and that is like if we can relate that to our today's life on an individual level or like a community level, that either more the community or the group is equipped on a like a knowledge base, skill base, you see, like they are more successful if we attribute that to the ability, adding to the circumstances and the fortune, as Machiavelli calls it. Then we deal with it, the way how we combat it, it will be basically using wisdom to approach. Yeah.
He says the most difficult things and the most dangerous things, and the things which create more doubt in the people towards your leadership as a new leader, is if you introduce new procedures. And so the 4 examples which he gives, only one of them introduces new procedures. I mean, technically we could say Theseus introduces new kind of a system of ruling, but in terms of how he ruled, he didn't change much from what his ancient forefathers were doing. But the only true change was Musa alayhi salam.
Exactly.
So, and then he says that this specific example of Musa alayhi salam we cannot discuss because he was divinely chosen for it.
But I think when he mentioned Nabiullah Musa alayhi salam, and he said that he's chosen by God, so that's kind of like, you know what, stay in the lines of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be kind of successful. So that's a point that when I read, I'm like, I thought straight away, I'm like, stay in line with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles, the Sirat Mustaqim, you will be successful no matter what.
Yeah, exactly. The other 3 examples sacrifice their own morals, say, to keep their kingdom afloat, whereas he didn't. So he's the only one that was able to succeed without any compromise.
I think it's easy to persuade people to be on your side at the start, but it's much more harder to convince them to remain on your side throughout the change.
And he makes that point as well.
He mentions the prophets. He says prophets who came with power continued being in power, but prophets who came without power, they basically, he uses the word persuaded the people at the start, but later on the people went against them. It's as important to keep the people on your side throughout the change, as well as to basically have them on your side at the start of the change.
He gives the example of Girolamo Savonarola as evidence why the reason why his state didn't work is because he came in with the ability, but he had no ability to hold it at the end because he didn't force them to believe. He talks about two things which prevent supporters from being reliable, say. Because he says that especially people who prophets or kings that come with new procedures, they will create enemies of anybody who is benefiting from the old procedures.
Yes.
And so these enemies are likely to dissuade your followers from being like 100%, say. And he gives two examples. One, fear of the enemy, especially those who have law on their side. So, for example, when we're talking about the Arabite, they had the Pope on their side. And then the second is the lack of faith of men. Because men don't really believe in things which are new. They believe in things which have succeeded by experience. I kind of link that to, say, the Battle of Uhud. Many people didn't even join. Many people would come to the Prophet and ask, oh, you know, do you want us to fight? And in the Quran, it says, those people who have come to ask you, they are hypocrites, or they do not want to join you. And the people who go in and join you without asking you are your true supporters.
Although the point that I had in here is that it might gives us the false impression that prophets, or like what he says is a prophet, but if we talk more about rulers in general, saying, you know, they need to be armed, is not just in terms of weapons, but and military. It can be like the skills, the knowledge, being independent in terms of industry, or being an independent nation.
Yeah, adding to that, when he suggests about weaker kind of allies and how belief fades, he says that you need to force faith upon them once more. And he says to do that by arms. And so a lot of people kind of look at this chapter as, as you said, this means that every king, every prophet, and every imam had an army behind them, but it's not the army that we're thinking of. Well, a good example is Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. He had a huge army of what? Of scholars, of debaters, people who would go into the courts of Harun al-Rashid, for example, and debate the faith. So this is someone who's armed with knowledge of Ahlul Bayt and has the ability to defend it and to renew the faith of the people by force. Logic is hard force. Like, you can't refute. If something makes sense, you can't refute it.
Nabi Yusuf didn't use his sword, didn't use anything. All I think he done is knowledge, is the miracles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him to show the people, you know what, 7 years of like welfare and stuff, and then 7 years of qahd that you have to, and I think people started, you know what, this is what he's talking about, so
absolutely.
Forced, but it's not forced, as Sister Mariam said, by sword. It's forced by knowledge. It's forced by showing the people the right way, that this is the way to go.
Exactly. Or sometimes not necessarily through logic, like Behlul, like through his wisdom. So from here, like you can see how Machiavelli sort of gives us the distinction of the characteristics of supporters. So where he gives the example of the independent supporters, where they are sort of firm, they are confident, and they don't rely on others, because he gives us the option, well, which is best, to rely on self and use power and arms, or rely on others. We can give the examples of the Battle of Karbala, because those people, they had no aim, no goal, except an-nasr or shahada, victory or martyrdom. They had nothing behind them or in front of them except this aim. This way they have actually knowledge. They develop this through knowledge and heart. As opposed to this, where he gives the example, the lukewarm defenders who don't have that enthusiasm. So those, when you can say, like, those are really weak or dependent or cool supporters. I'm not sure if you should call them supporters, really, because those ones, they you cannot rely on them. They are very easy to submit and choose treaties, as opposed to go and face the war, for example.
I also think we can relate that to Imam Mahdi alayhi salam when he comes, and that he talks about lukewarm defenders. I think that's going to be something that I've heard you talk about in the last weeks as well, that people who claim to be the believers and the supporters of Imam Mahdi will end up being the ones that may betray him. And I think that's something that we should relate that to as well.
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at Muslim ibn Aqil and what happened with him, I mean, at the start, he had most of the Kufa with him. And then, but by the end of the night, all of them turned against him. So it's those same people that were pleading to Imam Hussein, and they were asking Imam Hussein to come and rescue them from Muawiyah. It's those same people who went and killed Imam Hussein.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to take you guys back to the point of using force, as Machiavelli calls it, because sometimes like force can be applied. For example, when people start to have bid'ah, for instance, you need to stop them, and like so this doesn't, for example, improve and create that chaos in society. Like I remember discussing this with Mariam before and giving the example of, for example, Al-Shalghamani and the example of the son of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam.
Shalmaghani was one of the wukala مالت السفير الثالث Hussein bin Ruh. So during the minor occultation of Imam Ajalla Ta'ala Faraja. So he was I believe, الوكيل مالت الكوفة. What happens that Hussein bin Ruh would send him the letters and he would then distribute them among the believers, or when it came to collecting khums, he would collect and then relay that to Hussein bin Ruh. However, he wanted more political power, given Hussein bin Ruh was established in the Abyssinian Caliphate, given his family status, and people really believed in him, and he was given a lot of more leniency than, say, the previous two Sufara. What Shalmaghani then did was he started to collect al-Khumus for himself, and he started to change the preaching. He started, first of all, by creating doubt in Hussein bin Ruh and saying that he was meant to be the Safir. Then after that, he slightly changed it and he said, well, actually, I'm the reincarnation of the Imam. And then he changed it even more to a degree that he was saying that the Imam, Ajalla Ta'ala Farajah, is the incarnation of Shaitan, and he is the incarnation of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. And so when this happened, at that stage, Imam sent a khatim to Hussein bin Ruh saying, this man, if he does not change his ways, must be killed. So it's because he was creating such trouble at the time, and he was spreading so much falsehood, which was very damaging.
That obviously damaging to the beliefs and to the aqaid of people.
It's more damaging than the sword in a degree.
Exactly. Yeah, like such wrong beliefs, if you like. And then the other example is the uncle of Imam al-Hujjah, Ajjallahu Farajah, the brother of Imam al-Askari, Ja'far ibn Imam Ali al-Hadi. He was very envious of his brother and his status, and how Shia were so much like they loved him and they liked him. And after his departure, after the martyrdom of Imam al-Askari, he claimed that Imam al-Askari had no successors, and he was the last Imam, and he wanted to basically he's like, I'm the one to inherit the Imam. And he got the idea that Imam al-Asr Ajalla Farajah was born, and unfortunately he's the one who betrayed Imam al-Asr, and he's the one basically who went and told the Abbasid that the Imam existed and made them follow him, unfortunately. And they tried to make a trap for him, but they obviously they didn't succeed. And that's how he was called Ja'far al-Kadhab. And the story comes from a narration from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, where I can't remember who was asking Imam al-Baqir, one of his companions, said he was basically giving his, stating his beliefs to the Imam, and he said, I believe in you as my Imam, and asked him about the second Imam, and he said the following Imam would be Imam al-Sadiq, alayhi salam and asked why would he was called as-Sadiq, and all the Imams are Sadiq. And he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called him in the skies, in heavens, as-Sadiq, to distinguish him from Ja'far al-Kadhab, who would be the son of Ali al-Hadi alayhi salam. So like that title, Ja'far al-Sadiq, is basically given from heaven to Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam. When Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam was asked about his uncle, he says something along the lines, he is like Ukhwat Yusuf, as in like he betrayed basically the Imam, and he was so envious of him.
Yeah.
There was one point where he says that if people don't believe willingly, you need to sort of make them believe by force. We refuse it straight away because we put this connotation exactly with how ISIS are trying to portray Islam. Because like, you know, ISIS is just like, you know, you either believe or you get killed. No, this is not Islam. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly said, La ikraha fi din. And Imam Ali alayhi salam himself says, لو ثنيت لي الوسادة لحكمت أهل القرآن بالقرآن وأهل الإنجيل بالإنجيل وأهل التوراة بالتوراة. Meaning that he would not force anyone to believe as long as it's the truth, because he wouldn't let them do something against the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that clearly shows how like he would not force anyone to believe in a religion or another. And how the Prophet as well let like the Jews live the way they are, and the Christians live the way they are, and he opened it for debates, and he says, okay, let's come and discuss and see who's right. He didn't even say I am the right guy, and let's come and discuss and see who's on the right path.
I mean, weren't the debates of Imam Rida alayhi salam, he would debate them with their own books, not by the Quran, because they don't believe in the Quran.
Exactly.
So when it comes to, also when we're talking, say, the knowledge forcing, it's not about convincing them with something that you believe, but actually reshaping what they believe in and shedding light to what they have ignored in what they believe.
Exactly. And not believe me because I say so and so. No, believe the truth, because truth is coming out of this mouth.
I think the best people, the best forces are those who are able to break down that kind of barrier that people have, which is their ego and their stubbornness with, oh, I believe this and stuff like that. It's like what Imam Rida did. He was able to completely go through that barrier that people put up, and that's a really important skill to have.
And these are the soldiers of the Imam.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us in today's conversation about how to gain a principality through one skill. Inshallah, next week we'll be looking at the opposite of how someone may gain a principality through their own fortune or by luck. We'll see you all next week as we look at chapter 7.